A few times every year, I see a project get canceled or a Kickstarter get pulled because it used the intellectual property of another company. What's worse is sometimes the creator thinks they're using a fan policy which would allow them to do this. In this video, we're going to look at how to make the most out of fan content policies, why they can be really truly awesome for a creative person, but also how to avoid the pitfalls that will lead you into the wrong side of using another company's intellectual property. All on success in RPGs. Fan content policies allow you to do really cool stuff, like what you're seeing on the screen right now. This is my YouTube channel, and look at that. I am using images of a flump. I'm using image from the Neverwinter game up here in this Whispering Caverns video. I can do all this neat things because I'm using a fan content policy. And so today we're going to talk about how we can make fan content policies. But let's first set up the situation of what is intellectual property. And this gets a little tricky because it covers a number of different areas. And the main things are copyright and trademarks. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not giving you legal advice. This is meant to help you understand the concepts. If you are ever curious about this, you should do a good amount of research. And if you ever think that you're possibly going to be on the wrong side of the law, you should hire a lawyer. But intellectual property is going to often run you into trouble around two different areas. And I say into trouble because I'm thinking about how you might use someone else's intellectual property. But these things are all good things to have because they protect you when you create something. So there's always two sides to it, right? So intellectual property, you're going to have copyright. Whenever I write something that's original, I'm writing up a blog entry, or I create a product with like really neat ideas for how a spellcaster could dress up their magic, their spell casting. That is copyrighted. Automatically, it becomes my copyright. If I create a logo, if I name myself something, that is a trademark, right? So you see the little icon there with my logo that I had created and my trademark of Alphastream game design. Those are my trademarks. And both of these elements that I create, or the ones that you create, become yours, and others can't use them because of that intellectual property, right? So that's all really great. So why do we need a fan policy, and what's the point of them? Fan policies come across because of a couple of different angles that influence companies and make them want to provide you with fan policies. The first one is public relations, or PR. If you think of, say, something huge like Star Wars, right? Fans want to interact with that brand. And if the company that owns it, Disney, were to say, no, you can't touch this at all, sorry, it's ours, that would be really bad for public relations, right? Folks would say, come on, you're being a terrible corporation, the way they do other times for other reasons. So PR, right? Companies feel they must let fans interact with their brand to some extent. The other thing is it actually helps the brand, right? So if you think of all the times that you've seen someone's fan art of something like Critical Role, that's awesome. People get excited about that. And so the brand is furthered because of all of these people who are making use of your fan policy and using the policy to share excitement and bring others into the fold. Then we have fair use. Fair use, I'm not going to fully cover from a legal standpoint, but it's the idea that there are a number of legally covered ways that you can interact with material. So a good example is if you think of a news reporter that's doing a news story, and for some reason they end up wanting to talk about the Forgotten Realms, they get to do that. It's fair use to say, hey, here's what this is about, or to cover something like a novel, right? If I want to talk about Game of Thrones, that is fair use to talk about it, to explore it, to blog about it. So a lot of things are actually covered in fair use already and don't really need a fan policy, but the fan policy helps clarify where those lines begin and end. There's a balance to be had here, right? Between the company's rights to protect its intellectual property so that it can continue to use it without losing its ownership of it, and us as creators trying to make cool things. And it's really helpful if, as a creator, we think, what is like for the company, right? They're trying to pay salaries, they're trying to further their company, they're trying to do really neat things with the intellectual property that they own, I should respect that, right? Am I doing something that could damage them in some way? Am I doing something that could take away from them? Am I trying to profit off of what they've allowed me to do? If we think of it from both sides like that, we'll usually end up in a good place doing something that's going to be healthy for everybody. So let's talk about the kinds of things that you can do with a fan policy, because there's some really, really neat things that you can do. We already, looked at this example. My YouTube thumbnails often use all this art that I pull out of, say, the Neverwinter video game or art that's from official sources. In a similar way, I use art on my blog. So a lot of these are pictures, like what you're looking at the top here. That's a picture that I took. But as we get down further, we see art that's hanging on their walls. We see a shot from their video game that we're creating. And then we start seeing like, hey, here's an example in this What to Expect from the Wizards of the Coast D&D Creative Summit. I use art right out of one of their books. And that's okay because it's within the guidelines of their fan content policy. And it allows me to dress up all of my blog entries so that when I look at any one of these, I can share cool art. I can also share my own creations, but I can share the art that is from their books. And that is okay to do because of how the fan content policy works. So as you can see, we can do some really neat stuff with official artwork being used on blogs and videos. We can also break down obscure lore for people or do something like I've got a blog post that has the timeline of the Forgotten Realms. And it lists the timeline that I've figured out for all of the 5th edition official adventures. Lots of folks come and look at that. It's completely free, and it uses Wizards intellectual property, and that's totally okay, right? Or you could draw fan art of Critical Role and share it. And often, Critical Role will share it for you, bringing attention to you. I've seen friends of mine who've created really cool free supplements that are on their websites, and then people check out their Patreon or sign up for the mailing list. Right? You might create a cool free supplement that is something like Elminster's Lost Spells, completely free, and it's on your website showing off how good you are at designing spells, and that might get you a design job with somebody. But you have to be careful that as a creator, your examples aren't all based on someone else's intellectual property. Imagine you're going to hire an artist and you see that they have these really cool Star Wars art, but it's all Star Wars art, and it's all, based on intellectual property of someone else. You kind of end up wondering, hey, can this creator actually create their own stuff, or do they only copy things? Because you probably want to hire them for original art because you can't use Star Wars art in your product that you're going to actually sell. So those are some things that you want to be careful about. And there are many other things that you can't do, right? So I can't hire an artist to create art for a fan project and then sell copies to recoup that cost. I can't emulate the Planescape logo and then put it on a cover so that this looks totally like an actual Planescape product that's super professional and official, because now I'm mimicking the trade dress and trademarks of another company, right? I can't say, hey, I'm going to have this free supplement that's on, it's a series of blogs that provides all of this, say, free magic items, or even a free magic item PDF download, but then I also go and sell it on another site to help cover my costs of making it. Though that second part is not all right. There are many other examples, and again, I'm not a lawyer. If you are ever in doubt as to whether you're on the right side of it, hire a lawyer. For a lot of these things, you won't pay a lot. It'll just take a couple of hours of their time if they understand the gaming area or understand copyright and trademark very well. They can just quickly, it's not going to be cheap, but it's usually affordable if it's important. Your budget will have to cover this because it's really important that you not spend a bunch of money and end up down the wrong path. The last thing that I'll note is that if you are ever going to deviate from a fan policy, then you need a written and signed license or legal agreement that says that you're allowed to do that, right? If I'm going to say, hey, I'm going to do pictures of Greedo as fan art out of Star Wars, but then I'm also going to put it on t-shirts, I need a license for that. I need some sort of a legal agreement. And it doesn't help if I say, talk to somebody at Disney that thought that they really dig my art, or that, yeah, you should totally make t-shirts of it. They may not have understood the context in which we were talking about, and nothing about our conversation is going to be official like that. You really need a legal agreement that says that you can go beyond that fan policy. All right, so when don't we need a fan policy? We may not actually even need to follow the fan policy, and there are a couple of cases where that's the case. So, for example, if I'm not using anyone's intellectual property, right? If I'm creating my own role-playing game that doesn't touch on anyone's intellectual property, hey, no fan policy needed at all. I don't need to follow anyone's guidelines. I'm just doing my own thing, right? I'm not using the Critical Role world of Exandria. I'm making my own world. That's totally fine. Or if it's fair use, if technically when I'm blogging about the Forgotten Realms timeline, that is fair use to discuss. If I record my podcast, right, Mastering Dungeons, when we break apart the rules of D&D and tell you what's in the Dungeon Master's Guide, that kind of discussion is fair use. We aren't giving you a copy of the Dungeon Master's Guide. We're talking about it, and the way we talk about it does not allow you to reassemble all of the value of that product. So it's absolutely fair use for us to just have those discussions. The last one is a really interesting one. You don't need a fan policy if you're operating under a license. So if I publish on the DM's Guild, I am using that license that's involved in the DM's Guild. I'm no longer under the fan policy. And that's both good and bad, right? So one is I'm following all these guidelines that allow me to say, create an Eberron product. But now that I'm under that license, I can't talk about Planescape if Planescape's not open on the DM's Guild. And I can't create Dark Sun. And I can't use the Dark Sun logo when I'm on the DM's Guild, right? That license doesn't allow me to then tie into a fan policy, which isn't a license, just the fan policy, because I am using this other license. So you have to be careful that you don't cross the streams, right? You are using this particular license and no longer using the fan policy, and therefore aren't using it. Finally, let's look at how to understand an actual fan policy. There are some typical sections of a fan policy, and once you've seen a few of them, you'll have a good feel for what they look like. So let's break that down. Usually there's an introduction. The introduction will often state, hey, this is a fan policy, it is not a license. And that's really important to note. They're not giving you any rights. They're clarifying their position, because really this ties into fair use law. So they're just clarifying their understanding and how they look at things. And often the introduction will say, hey, we can sue you for whatever we want, right? And this is not like a Wizards thing or a Critical Role thing. This is all of them. Any of the examples that I show you, you'll see it has this kind of language, right? They're not giving up their rights by creating a fan policy, and it is not an agreement between the two of you. They're explaining their position to you. You can follow that, and if you break it, and even if you follow it, they can choose to sue you, right? They also have the right to change their fan policy at any time, because it's up to them to explain the guidelines and for you to follow what's reasonable. So that's super interesting, right? They could change their fan policy, and that would be up to you to change any existing work that's out there to follow the new changes. So often that's all into the introduction. Big part of what's in a fan policy is the word free. This is going to be always found in some kind of permutation, because what they are saying is you can't make money off of this. And that's probably the easiest way to look at it. If you are creating something under fan policy, are you making money? If you're making money, directly especially, but just making money, it's a danger, right? That is probably not what the fan policy intends. If you're making money indirectly, it may be okay. And we'll talk about that a little more. Now, another piece is they may say that you must credit them. So you may need to say, Dungeons and Dragons is a trademark of Wizards of the Coast. They may also want you to say, but this isn't official. And almost any fan policy will make it clear that what you need to do in your product is have it super obvious that this is fan content and not official content. So if you go back and that idea of like Elminster's Lost Spells, if you say something like, Elminster's Lost Spells, a fan supplement, cool. Now it's clear that you are creating fan product. But if you call it something like Dungeons and Dragons, colon, uh, lost spells of Ilminster, that sounds very official. And if you were to then try to like say put in something that looks like their trade dress, right, like the little uh, blaze fire thing that's on the bottom part of the binding of an official 5e book, or something that looks like their logo, that now is starting to look official, and that's not okay, right? So some other things, content standards. When you are following a fan policy, they're going to expect that the work that you're creating does not make them look bad, hurt their audience, or hurt their standing in any way, right? So you must follow typical content standards. You can't have hate speech in there. You can't have racism. You can't have anything that would possibly offend or hurt someone that views your product. Another one that's interesting is often they will say one of these two things. Either don't send it to me. This is the company saying, right? Do not send me a copy of what you created because we can't look at it. And that's to avoid you saying, hey, I made this thing that looked official. I sent it to them. They then published something 3 years later that looked kind of like this in some way. They owe me money. So they may say, don't send it to me. The other thing they might say is, we own it. And there are a number of policies that will do this. So if you look at the critical role policy, for example, it'll say that anything you create is something that they could use if they want to. And sorry, own it is a little heavy here. Really what I should say here is they have the right to use it, right? And they, of course, own the larger intellectual property. So critical role is saying, hey, critical role is ours. If you create some kind of cool thing, we could have the absolute right to use it because you used our fan policy. And that covers them from any case in the future where you might want to sue them because you think that somehow they were inspired by your thing, right? That's what this is about. They're not really trying to take ownership of anything of yours. They're not trying to make a product like yours. They want to protect themselves from you suing them, telling them that they did. So they'll have some language in there that prevents that. The other thing they might have is a prohibited format. Often software is going to be one of them. So it's totally cool if you want to create Numenera fan fiction. But if you try to create an app that collects everyone's fan fiction together and some kind of like, no, now you're trying to create a platform or a software tool, and that's going to be a problem. So they may stipulate these kinds of things like no databases, no apps, no... And it varies by company what they will want to do. Like, you can't make a board game out of this or something like that. There'll be those kinds of aspects to the policy. I want to go back and talk about two things that are often permitted under fan content policies. One is video, and the other is indirect income. So video is often permitted because of the rise of places like YouTube. So they usually in the fan policy want to make it clear that you are allowed to create videos that talk about it. Like, for example, here I am in this video using a picture from Volta the Dracolich, an adventure I worked on. I don't own that adventure. Wizards of the Coast does. They created that art, but I can use it here on a video. So they will say that that's okay, right? They will also often say that specific to a platform like YouTube or other similar platforms, you can indirectly earn money, right? So if I were earning money through ads, it's okay for me to have ad revenue from that video. I'm not selling a product directly, but just it's what I do. If I'm a person who cares about income coming from videos, that's considered something that you do, and it's okay for you to continue to earn that. Similarly, I could have, as I do, a Patreon where I say, hey, support the work that I'm doing, which is, blogging and creating and making videos. Those things do include fair use fan content items, but my Patreon is not somehow locking that content away, right? It's indirect income that you may like the work I do. You're not purchasing these intellectual property pieces. But you may be having an enhanced experience because of it, if that makes sense, right? So that's the difference. It's totally fine to have indirect revenue that you do that helps you make money of the work you do, but you are not locking away their intellectual property in some way. It's indirect income rather than direct income for a product that they are buying. Okay, so let's end by reviewing a few content policies that are out there as examples of the kind of wording that we can expect to find. So first up is the Wizards of the Coast fan content policy. This one comes up a lot because D&D is so very popular, so is Magic the Gathering. And so this policy, which you can see has not been updated since 2017, guides a lot of the work. So let's take a look. They talk about why fan content is awesome for them. We love that you make cool things. And then they say, hey, what can you or can't do with our IP, their intellectual property? And the first thing they say is one word, free, right? Free means free. You can't require payments, surveys, downloads, subscriptions, or email registration to access your fan content. Can't sell or license your fan content to any third parties. Your fan content must be free for others, including Wizards, to view, access, share, and use without paying you anything, obtaining your approval, or giving you credit. And all of these things stand on their own, right? So you can't require payments for your fan content stands separately from the next bullets, right? These are all individual things. What they do say is you can subsidize your fan content by taking advantage of sponsorships, ad revenue, and donations as long as it doesn't interfere with people getting to it. So this is that kind of thing we were talking about where, if you have a Patreon, that's fine. It just can't be that the file is only available to Patreon subscribers, right? You must tell the community it's unofficial. So you have to make it clear that this is not in any way an official product. And this is where some folks really run into trouble, because one of the cool things you want to do as a designer is go, look, I can make stuff as if it were official. I get it. I love working on official products. So I understand that call. And these days we have access to really cool layout tools, and it makes us want to say, create an awesome Dark Sun product that looks totally like a Dark Sun product. But that's a problem, because the more we make it look official, we are violating the fan content policy. So it has to be really clear that it's not official. And one of the ways they do that is please include a note with your fan content policy that says, hey, I'm following the fan content policy. This is not approved or endorsed by Wizards. Portions of this material use the property of the that is copyrighted by Wizards. It doesn't say where to put this, but again, it has to be clear it's unofficial. So it's not like you can make it look like this is an official Dark Sun product and then stick this somewhere in the back, right? This must be in there, this content note, but it has to be clear that it's not official. And I know that's often really painful, but that's where people run into trouble. I can't run a Kickstarter and use the word Dark Sun, and I can't make it look like Dark Sun with a logo that has a rising sun, but it's called something else, Smark Sun, right? Like, no, not okay. And then I can't just bury this statement somewhere and they try to cover it. Like, all these things are individually true, right? Don't hurt others. So you have to respect other people's IP. You can't use someone else's stuff in your fan content. And in fact, they say here that it should not have crossovers or mashups, right? So what this technically means is, Elminster shouldn't have a lightsaber in your art, because you could run into trouble when you cross over different fan content policies or IPs. Again, there's fair use standards that you can follow here. Consult a lawyer if in doubt. But you can see what they're coming from here, and that if you try to mash things together, it can create a problem for one or both of the companies. Don't hurt Wizards. And again, this is pretty logical, right? Like, imagine if this was your product that someone's trying to work off of under a fan content policy. Would you like what you're trying to do to Wizards product, right? Don't use your logos and trademarks. This one's one that I see often folks fall afraid of, because they want it to make it look like it, right? I want my product to look like an Eberron product, and I want to have a logo on it. That's what the DMs Guild is for. You can't do that in a unofficial product, right? You really want to say Eberron in something that doesn't at all look like the official trade dress or official logo. Don't mess with the legal notices in our things. So this is if you're using, like, say, a piece of artwork and it has a logo on it, like a cover of a book, and you're showing it in a thumbnail. Don't remove that piece to try to make look like it's somehow yours, right? Don't remove their copyright, their logos, their trademarks from something that you're sharing. Don't use their IP in other games. Don't use their video or music in your fan content, which is very interesting, but that's often because those have contracts with third parties, as they state here. No bad stuff, so you've got to follow content standards. Safe sponsorship. This is where if you have sponsorships involved, you want to follow these guidelines. And there are larger laws of the land here that are governed. So your fan content has to go with whatever your regional rules are, your country rules, all of that. And as they say here, don't violate the laws of your region, country, plane, or dimension. Don't put us into any legal battles. And they say if we have to use lawyers, you are responsible for all the fees. And then they have sort of FAQ that has a few questions. Let's take a look really quickly at Critical Role. Critical Role has updated their fan policy, I think, 3 different times, last in 2022. Each time they've started, their original one was very permissive, and they didn't even have one for a while. And then they start going, hey, we kind of need to lock some things down. You can't just, publish works that are based on our characters. So they talk about what is their IP, right? It is Vox Machina, it is Mighty Nine, it is Grog Strongjaw, and so on. And it's their appearances, it's their language, it's all these different things are part of their intellectual property. But they do say, hey, that if you want to do this, that's totally cool. Here's how you can create things for non-commercial use. And they say if it's in any way making money, if it's in any way commercial, then you have to follow what's written further below, which are things like, indirect money off of YouTube videos because you're talking about the show and how much you love it. And so they get into all kinds of things that you can do and can't do. So you cannot create commercial fan projects that crowdsource or involve a business or legal entity or gate the fan project or anything like that. So you see, it starts being similar to all the examples we've given in the past. But they have a very extensive policy here that goes through all of that. Passive ad revenue is fine. So if your website, your blog normally earns some money from people clicking on links or things like that, that's fine. That's passive. It just can't be direct, right? You can't go put a Critical Role product on DriveThruRPG or itch.io for download, even if it's available free as a blog series, right? Like that, those are just things you can't do. And they give you some examples of what's called transformative work, and that they're saying that your creation of any fan project for Critical Role can only be used if you do something that is transformative, meaning there must be something original to what you're doing, which is to say you can't just copy our stuff, right? You can't just take our Amazon TV show and do a same version with similar animation, right? Like it's got to be your own thing in some way to even be used in the fan content policy, because otherwise you're almost saying like, come to my site, not to the official site, right? And that's where that runs you into problems. And they have some stipulations around things based on duration, right? So each of these policies can have something that's very interesting based on the particular nature of the medium. Are you going to be talking about our show for so long that someone really should be just watching the show instead of watching what you're doing, right? Are you sort of taking over what we're doing? Can my fan project make reference to Critical Role? And it covers how you can, and it gives you a statement. This project is unofficial fan content and is not approved or endorsed in any way by Critical Role, right? That's the kind of language they want to see you using. And so when you use that kind of language, you're protecting yourself by making it so obvious that this is fan content and not official, and you're avoiding running into trouble. A lot of times what they really do is they're trying to say, just be considerate, right? Like think of us as you would a friend and don't cross the lines. You can create Critical Role related video content, but you can't do that before the content is available on their YouTube channel, right? Don't spoil things on that side, right? That is a thing that is prohibited because of the nature of their business. So there are a lot of other particular pieces like this. Generally you can't use their logos and trademarks. And they say we can use whatever you create, right? And we can share it, which they often do. Like they'll take fan art and they'll share it, and that's a good example of the things they can do. And then they have some additional things that lawyers have said, and that kind of rounds that out. Monty Cook Games has a policy here, and they have an interesting distinction where they talk about. If you're talking about our games, about our lore, you don't even need this policy. But if you're making something for the game, then you must follow this policy carefully to make sure that you're not violating it. I think that's kind of a neat way to look at it, right? So if I'm talking about things on a podcast, that's just a thing you get to do. If I am making an actual play of the game, that's cool. It's about the game. But if I'm creating actual setting material, now we're getting into trouble because that's for it. They talk about products versus communities. So if you're creating cool things like a website that lots of people can enjoy, that everybody has access to, that's neat. If it's a product, that's a no, right? They talk about trademark and copyright, things that you can reproduce. For example, like, hey, if you use our images on your website, it's totally cool. When you can, identify the artist, recognize where it came from. All of that is useful to break down any barriers and keep your use good. They talk about things that you can't do. So like here they're saying, you can't use artwork if you alter it or combine it. The only thing you can do is resize it or crop it. Right? So it's always important to read for very specific pieces that can run you into trouble with this company. And look, a lot of times companies aren't in the business of finding you and suing you. You could fly under their radar, or they may even see it and decide that you're not worth going after. But the more that you're causing problems, you might be encouraging others to also cause problems. And in the end, it leads to these companies having more and more restrictive fan policies. So if we are all following it and doing the right thing, then it creates more opportunities for all of us, right? So really interesting. I'm going to include links to all of these. You can see like the Fantasy Flight Games, what they do, since they do into, and this is also for Asmodee, their board games and what they're looking at creations and how you can use them. And then last is Epic Games and what they say. All of these have different kind of neat examples. If you find some that you think are particularly useful, share them in the notes below, add a comment so that other people can see it as well. So I hope this has been helpful to you. Next time, we're going to talk about not the fan content policy side of things, but actually what it means to actually use a license. So stepping beyond fan content policy to where we actually want to make some money, what are the options if we want to use the intellectual property of another company? And we will look at things like the Creative Commons and the Open Gaming license from D&D. Next time on Success in RPGs.